I'm also with the Office of Global Perspectives, which is a partner of the Puerto Rico Research Hub. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. What we are doing today is a very, very important event that we hope to be able to do more of for the community. With us, we have Dr. Fernando Rivera, Director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at UCF. We're here today to listen to Dr. Julie Torres, who will share a little bit about her experience and educate us a lot about what we need to know about Puerto Rico in this time. I will tell you a little bit about her at this time. Dr. Julie Torres holds a Ph.D. in cultural anthropology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research focuses on issues related to Latinx studies, diaspora, social activism, transnationalism, and gender. She's currently a contributing co-editor of the Association of Latino and Latina Anthropologists section of Anthropology News and is a scholar in residence with the Puerto Rico Research Hub. This fall, she will be joining the faculty at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, as an assistant professor of women's and ethnic studies. Bienvenida, Doctora Torres. Welcome. In times of crisis, Puerto Rican activism in Orlando is what you will be hearing about, and some of what you'll be learning about will be what does the concept of crisis and what does it mean, and how do Puerto Rican activists respond to crisis in their own lives and communities. In this webinar, Dr. Torres will answer these questions and share the results of her ethnography of Puerto Rican activism in the Orlando metropolitan area, drawing on contemporary events or moments of crisis, such as the fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico, the shooting at Pulse nightclub, the 2016 integral role of women in the community, but also will demonstrate the ways that Puerto Rican activism transcends borders. Again, welcome, Dr. Julie Torres. The floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here virtually today, and to the Puerto Rico Research Hub for inviting me to share this research with you. Before I begin, I do want to take a moment to thank everyone who participated in this research. Some of you may be, tuning in today. You invited me into your homes, to your events, and you shared with me your stories. And without you, this work just wouldn't be possible. So thank you. And although I won't be, naming anyone today because of confidentiality reasons, you all know who you are, and I really do hope that this work does you justice. So for my talk, I'll be discussing my ethnography of Puerto Rican activism in Orlando, Florida. Foregrounding women's activism around different moments that are conceptualized in the public imagination as crisis. And I'll begin by discussing how I came to this project, because in many ways it came to fruition as I realized, as anthropologist Renato Rosaldo notes, quote, how much of life happens in ways that one neither plans for nor expects, end quote. Next slide. Previous one, yeah. I arrived in Orlando at what I consider to be a critical juncture. It was 2016, an election year, and the public fascination with the Latino vote was palpable. It was also a period marked by austerity and economic and social insecurity that crossed borders from Puerto Rico to Orlando. In June of that year, a gunman opened fire at Pulse nightclub, killing 49 and altering the atmosphere of the city. And just when I decided that I was done with field work, Hurricane Maria swept through the Caribbean. Its aftershocks felt from Puerto Rico to the United States, and still to this day. And so my work began to crystallize around these key events and salient issues that arose as a result. Slide. The discourse of crisis was pervasive. A debt crisis, a healthcare crisis, an education crisis, the crisis of disaster, a crisis of migration. Puerto Rico had become part of a world geography of crisis. But what exactly does it mean to be in crisis? Slide. So on the one hand, this research is a response to the public fascination with crisis. Crisis is oftentimes used discursively to denote exception. For instance, Agamben has maintained that crisis can generate a state of exception that forces people to accept measures that they might not otherwise accept. Quote, today, crisis means you must obey, end quote. He explains in a 2012 interview. Others, like anthropologist Janet Reutman, has positioned crisis as a blind spot that makes certain knowledges visible while foreclosing others. Slide. And so I was inspired to use crisis as a point of departure to ask, what does the concept of crisis obscure? And what does it make visible? And how do Puerto Ricans in Orlando respond to these so-called crises in their own lives and communities? So my work moves beyond popular notions of crisis, arguing that the fixation on crisis does little more than conceal longstanding inequalities, such as iterations of colonialism and second-class citizenship across transnational spaces. As one of my interlocutors once told me, the crisis has been a crisis all along. So if we position crisis as an extension of such injustices, then it's not exceptional at all. And yet, as I will discuss today, it still has the power to generate possibilities as people begin to imagine and create alternatives. Now, before I go into a discussion of the key events that inspired this research, I want to briefly contextualize my methods and my field site. As previously mentioned, research was conducted in the Orlando metropolitan area between January 2016 and January 2018. The data for this project was collected using ethnographic research methods. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with ethnography, very simply put, it's a way to understand human culture that involves long-term participation and observations of social life on the part of the researcher. And so during this period, I conducted participant observations of protests, organizational meetings, get out the vote efforts, and other cultural events in the community. I also conducted 48 semi and unstructured interviews, along with countless other informal conversations with activists, politicians, and Puerto Rican migrants who were born either in Puerto Rico or the United States. And I met many of my interlocutors through several Puerto Rican and Latinx organizations in the community. And finally, I complemented this data with newspaper, census, and social media archives in order to contextualize the demographic and the social landscape of the region. So in 2017, Florida replaced New York as the state with the largest Puerto Rican population, with 1.2 million Puerto Ricans currently residing in the state. I spent most of my time in the Orlando-Kissimmee area in Orange and Osceola counties, which contain the largest concentration of Puerto Ricans in the region. And here you can see the numbers. There are currently over 300,000 Puerto Ricans residing in these two counties alone. And these numbers include those arriving directly from Puerto Rico and those arriving from other points of the diaspora like New York and Chicago. And historically, this migration was influenced by a number of different factors, including labor recruitment, real estate marketing, and the opening of Walt Disney's theme park, which not only brought jobs, but also increased real estate speculation to the region, but also created this image of Orlando as, you know, quote, the happiest place on earth. But in recent years, a major push factor has been the economic instability of Puerto Rico. Hurricane Maria has also since exacerbated this exodus. According to the most recent census data, between July 2017 and July 2018 alone, nearly 130,000 people have left the archipelago, with a little over 56,000 arriving here in Florida. Now, rather than focus on one particular aspect of my work, I'd like to spend the rest of my time giving you a brief overview of the 4 key events that I discuss, because each demonstrates both the structural and the everyday manifestations of crisis. Because of time constraints, I won't go into each in as much detail as I would like, but I'd be more than happy to expand on any one of these events during the Q&A. Now, people hear the word crisis, and they commonly think about some sort of disaster or catastrophe, like the first 2 events that I'll discuss. And I should mention that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is painful in a lot of ways, and it might be triggering to some. Okay, so I'll start with Pulse. Almost 2 weeks ago marked the 4-year anniversary of the shooting at Pulse nightclub. And just to put this into perspective, over 90% of the victims were Latinx, and nearly half, 23 of the 49, were Puerto Rican. Now, if you had any doubts, all you had to do was walk around the city in the days following the attack. The Puerto Rican flag gently rolled onto the concrete. The candle to a patron saint lit near a loved one's photograph, and the messages of love and solidarity chalked out in Spanish on the sidewalk. Now, these material expressions stood in stark contrast to the erasure of queer, brown, and Black bodies from the public imaginary in the early days following the attack. And so I write about the silences and the refusals, what I consider to be the language of crisis. And I do this in part by describing the establishment of Proyecto Somos Orlando, the We Are Orlando project, by a group of local Latinas, Puerto Rican women in particular, who provided translation, mental health, and legal services for the LGBTQ+ community. As one of the Somos co-founders put it, quote, "The Latino voice was not part of the narrative, and no nos dio la gana, we didn't feel like keeping quiet," end quote. And I want to share some of their reflections of that day. And these are the words of 2 of the co-founders recalling the events of that morning of arriving at the Hampton Inn and the LGBT center here in Orlando, where family and friends were gathering to hear news about their loved ones. Slide. Quote, "We went over there and that's when we realized. It was confirmed by walking in and seeing all the brown faces that this was more than an LGBTQ tragedy. It was a Latino tragedy. When you have law enforcement making announcements about how to move from there to another center, and they do it only in English, we're like, excuse me, you need to repeat all that. La gente estaba como, ¿qué fue lo que dijo? People were like, what did they say? Like lost. In the midst of their anguish, to add insult to injury, they were completely lost and confused," end quote. Previous slide, please. And here's another reflection about arriving at the LGBT+ center here in Orlando. Quote, "There were very few people who looked like me at the center, and all you kept hearing was LGBT, LGBT. For me, having been in both spots, it's like, no, Latino LGBT, Latino LGBT. My head was exploding. My hair was on fire. Not even in the hospital in 2016, you can't find someone to talk to these people in Spanish and in English," end quote. The privileging of English, previous slide, please. Can you just stay on the, yeah. The privileging of English by the city of Orlando and other first responders that are described here speaks to the existence of linguistic borders that ultimately inhibits access to key information and resources in times of crisis. It points to the ways that language marks public spheres of belonging And it also speaks to the whiteness of queer spaces, as we see in the second excerpt. So the founding of Somos emerged as a deliberate affirmation of Latinx identity and a refusal to be erased and silenced by this normalization of whiteness within the umbrella term LGBTQ. And I think of the words of the late Esteban Jose Munoz, who wrote that, quote, queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world, end quote. And it's this idea of potentiality that engenders hope, a reimagining of what could be. And this, I argue, is what Puerto Rican activists in Orlando are actively engaged in. Slide. And we see this also with Hurricane Maria. Now, I want us to resist thinking about the hurricane as a singular event that has a clear beginning, middle, and end, but rather think about it as an event rooted in historical, cultural, social, and economic contexts. Slide. So thinking about the effects of colonial policies like the 1920 Jones Act, which requires that all goods transported between US ports must be carried by US vessels owned and operated by US citizens. Now, this prohibited foreign boats from delivering food, fuel, and other much needed emergency supplies to Puerto Ricans. In contrast, the Department of Homeland Security suspended the Jones Act in Texas and Florida almost immediately following Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, respectively. And while the Jones Act was eventually temporarily suspended in Puerto Rico for 10 days, it wasn't until a full week after Hurricane Maria had made landfall. Now, in addition to underscoring such policies and the market-driven models of recovery that were happening in Puerto Rico post-Maria, what many scholars refer to as disaster capitalism, I also focus on relief efforts here in Orlando. Slide. And there were various groups in the community that were leading efforts to collect much-needed emergency supplies to send to Puerto Rico, and who were making demands of local and federal officials. And these are just some examples. On the left, you'll see a picture of a warehouse run by the Coordinating Group of Support and Solidarity with Puerto Rico, or CASA, for its Spanish initials. And this was a grassroots coalition of about 20 organizations that actually formed in anticipation of Hurricane Irma, but magnified their efforts because of Maria. And other organizations such as Vamos for PR, whose initial focus was addressing the Puerto Rican debt crisis, also began mobilizing recent arrivals and staging protests, such as the one here on the right in Kissimmee, where recent evacuees, many who were living in hotels with FEMA funding at the time, called out the Puerto Rican government for, in their words, abandoning them here in Central Florida. Now, such efforts force us not only to envision recovery beyond the borders of the archipelago, but also to reassess our understandings of belonging. And for instance, the grassroots efforts of a group of Puerto Rican women in Central Florida, who together with others across the diaspora, mobilized to establish Adopta un Pueblo, an Adopt a Town initiative, reveals something about the contours of Puerto Rican nationalism and citizenship. Now, they were critical of the mismanagement of supplies and concerned with the mental effects of darkness. So the group sought to provide solar light bulbs to Puerto Rico, one municipality at a time. And the building and the strengthening of social networks, both in Puerto Rico and across the diaspora, was integral to the success of the project, which was first piloted in Ciales, Puerto Rico. And as one of the women involved in the project explained, slide, quote, "Here on the mainland, it's making connections using Facebook, with people that are from Ciales, even though we don't know each other. It's been crazy. We've made such a great friendship with this woman that lives in Austin, and she's been collecting all of this stuff, and she messengers us. It's like a group of 35 people. Hi, here are the pictures of all the stuff I have. I just don't have the money to ship it. And so she opens up a PayPal account, and we just put money in. Everybody chips in, and she receives it, and then she sends pictures of the receipts from the post office. It's been nothing short of like a trust network. The foundation of the whole freaking thing has been trust, trusting in your fellow Latinos. And that's why we call it Los Hijos Auscentes dicen presente, because even though we're not in La Isla and we don't live in the same town, it's like we have Ciales here in the US, end quote. Now, these types of networks reflect what scholar Benedict Anderson has called an imagined political community, which is a community in which many members may never meet, but still share this attachment, in this case to Puerto Rico. And it's also a form of long distance nationalism. You know, let's take this slogan, Los Hijos Auscentes dicen presente, right? The allusion to fictive kin through the return of absent children and the act of adopting a town becomes symbolic of ethnic, of familial, of moral, and other bonds that adhere individuals to Puerto Rico and to each other. It reveals how Puerto Ricans, in a sense, are related or may configure their own notions of belonging, like the act of trying to create Ciales here in the US. Slide. But crisis is about much more than catastrophe. It's historical, it's lived, and it's embodied. Now, as many of you know, Puerto Rico is experiencing more than a $74 billion debt, which has resulted in a slew of austerity measures, including cuts to education, pensions, healthcare, and other public sectors. And people are actively resisting these measures, not only in Puerto Rico, but also here in Orlando. You know, and this reminds us that oppression and opposition, while oftentimes very much place-based, are far from insular. And in many ways, this discourse of crisis obscures how austerity and colonialism are historically intertwined. Activists and scholars alike have called attention to this, especially in light of the 2016 passing of Promesa, which established a fiscal control board. So I won't spend too much time on that particular aspect, but what I do want to call attention to is the fact that austerity encompasses more than just a set of economic and political policies. I argue in my research that it's also an intimate force that has the power to transform the lives of Puerto Ricans, not only in Puerto Rico, but also in the diaspora to Central Florida. And here, I'm interested in the ways that austerity shapes distances and proximities through forms of emotional and corporal displacement. And I want to share an excerpt from an interview with one woman who had migrated to Florida years before Puerto Rico had first defaulted on its debt. And although she couldn't return to visit her family, she maintained regular contact with her family back in Puerto Rico. Slide. Quote, "You know, my sister talks to me a lot about what is happening here in the neighborhood. My cousins talk to me a lot about what is happening in their neighborhood. So if a gallon of milk is like $6 or $7, if a gallon of gas is $5, you start thinking when you go here to the store, it's always on my mind how much I'm paying here for a gallon of milk, not knowing if in Puerto Rico, my family there has a gallon of milk that day. To me, it's painful. Knowing that my sister might have to work until she dies because she lost her retirement is painful. Knowing that there have been hospitals that are closing in sections because they cannot afford, the services are not there for people that need it. It's a humanitarian crisis. I'm worried. I'm very worried." End quote. Now, Puerto Rican migration to the US has long been characterized by circulation, what Jorge Duani has called mobile livelihoods, these flows of people, of ideas, practices between Puerto Rico and the United States. But here we can see that crisis also engenders a circulation of affect, of feelings of worry and pain that in many cases have intensified over the past 2 decades. So the intimacies of austerity are manifest in these emotional spaces between Puerto Rico and Orlando, and in the ordinariness of everyday lives. And in many cases, this is a driving force behind activism. On the one hand, austerity moves bodies, right? Like quite literally through migration. But on the other, it also moves people towards the work of social justice. And in fact, many of the Puerto Rican activists that I spoke with and observed in these different contexts make public the intimacies of austerity through sharing these kinds of stories at protests, at community forums, and at other events. Slide. But more than an ethnography of crisis, my work is also an ethnography of gender. And this carries over to my discussion of the political lives of Puerto Rican women and what I called a crisis of representation, these contestations over who has the right to represent the Puerto Rican community, especially in light of the racialization of Puerto Ricans and attempts to disenfranchise the community through acts like redistricting. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm very intentional in centering the words and experiences of Puerto Rican women. And I'm very much inspired by the work of Black and Latinx feminist theorists who have taught us about the importance of applying an intersectional lens to our analysis of oppression and privilege. And here I argue it's also important to an analysis of activism. Now, many of the women I spoke with had experience running political campaigns, canvassing, and doing other unpaid labor for local politicians. For instance, one woman recalled her experience working with a Latino man who was running for a local district commissioner seat here in Central Florida. Slide. Quote, "The people that were around us were women. The men don't get mixed up in it. They decide who's going to run, but it's women who basically manage all the stuff. When they have that time off, then they get involved because it's the door knocking, it's being at an event, putting on a table, giving flyers. So it's a lot of women. And if you go to places here, different meetings, you might have that experience. Son las mujeres que siempre están ahí." End quote. And another woman who was running for local office herself expressed her experiences with sexism in politics. Quote, "If it's a guy, it's like, oh, you should do it. You'd be great at it. If it's a woman, it's like, what gives you the qualifications to do it?" End quote. Now, throughout history, Puerto Rican women have played a major role in organizing and advocating for their communities, in resisting inequality, and in theorizing it. And we see that both in Puerto Rico and in Orlando. Puerto Rican women refuse to be relegated to the background. They're running and they're winning seats in local office. And they're deeply involved in public forms of placemaking that also recognizes how politics affects the everyday lives of Puerto Ricans through access to healthcare, education, clean water, and other essential needs. What one of my interlocutors very memorably calls politics in rice and beans terms. But I think it's important, especially in light of the current moment, to also reflect on the words of one Afro-Boricua activist who shared her experiences, oftentimes being the only Afro-Latina in meetings with other activists and local leaders. Slide. Quote, "There have been times that I've been in meetings where even particularly with Black Lives Matter coming up and the ways it's talked about around some Puerto Rican activists, it's like, oh, okay, we're going to be in solidarity. The assumption is that Puerto Ricans don't share the struggle based on your race." End quote. And I shared these examples to emphasize why an intersectional analysis of activism is so important, to compel us in our own work, whether that's in academia or out in our communities, to reflect on who takes up space and on how we may also be complicit in maintaining sexism and anti-Blackness. Now, I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I want to take a few minutes to try to synthesize this, because taken together, these events demonstrate the consequences of when the illusion of safety is shattered, when austerity has led to forced displacement and economic and emotional insecurity, when physical and metaphorical homes are destroyed by violence and by disaster, and when people must contend with threats to power and representation at all levels. These events are about injustices that do not begin nor end with moments of so-called rupture. And as I've discussed today, they're also about community and about claim making that cuts across borders. Slide. And to sum up my findings, I find that the socioeconomic and the political conditions in Puerto Rico have shaped the formation of an activist community in Orlando that very much imagines itself as part of a larger transnational Puerto Rican community. I also find that Puerto Ricans in Orlando are actively fighting against erasure from a local, national, and transnational landscape that values some lives above others. And lastly, that the discourse of crisis is just not sufficient to capture not only the structural violences, but also its everydayness. And this ethnography, in many ways, moves crisis beyond the abstract, showing how it travels and how it's embodied, both materially and emotionally, as well as the ways that Puerto Rican activism, in the context of diaspora, complicates insular narratives of social movements. Now, in closing, I want to return to Agamben's insistence that today crisis means you must obey. The more I reflect on this research and my fieldwork in Orlando, and on the current state of the world today, the more I realize that this simply isn't the case. Perhaps today, crisis means you must disobey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torres and Dr. Fernando Rivera.
Hello, everyone. So thank you, Julie, for a great presentation. I just want to take the moment to thank everybody that's participated here. I'm going to turn it back to Professor Coronado, and she's going to share with you some rules of engagements as we get into the question and answer part of it. But thank you all for being here. This is the first of what we want to be many type of opportunities to share some of our research. So be on the lookout for our next event. So Katie, I turn it over back to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So a couple of things to keep in mind. All of us will be muted, and we'll turn on the camera as voluntarily, so it's not required. Using the chat function for questions, and the webinar is recorded. Just as a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, you could see that at the top of the screen. And of course, you will have the opportunity to interact with Dr. Torres and ask questions, but as a reminder, you can choose the chat function and we will go in that order. At that time, then we will allow the camera function, and then you can show your video at that time so you can interact with Dr. Torres. Anything I left out, Dr. Rivera?
I think that covers it all. So if you feel, if you want to have a question, you can either, like Katie said, just type it or put your name out there and I'll try. So Kinda, if you can start sharing the screen so we can start seeing some of the faces of the people, that will be wonderful.
And then if I could add, in case you haven't Zoomed before, the chat function is on the bottom, on the little frame, the black frame. And so you can click on chat, and then in order for everybody to see your question, you go and you click on everyone, and then you type there, and you hit return, and then all of us will be able to see your question. Any questions on the rules and how? Perfect. Thank you, Patricia Silver. So we have our first question. Dr. Rivera, would you like me to continue?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay, so Dr. Torres, we have our first question from Eduardo Arroyo. Eduardo, welcome and thank you for your question. Do you think Puerto Ricans in Florida have developed a stronger sense of control and influence on external factors and on their own lives than when they were in Puerto Rico? If so, in which ways are they reflected?
Okay, thank you for your question. So have they developed a sense of control and influence on external factors, right? So I guess it depends also on what your viewpoint is and in terms of what's happening in Puerto Rico. But Puerto Ricans, you know, both in Puerto Rico have been resisting against these external structures, right? The racism embedded, these disaster capitalist measures that are occurring. And they're trying to do that here as well as part of the activist work. And of course, you know, they're going up against these structural problems, but bringing attention to them. I don't know if it's like, have they developed as much control over, right? Because I think they've actively been resisting and trying to change these systems actively, both in Puerto Rico and in here. So it's hard to quantify that, right? I'm telling you the experiences of the activists here who are trying to resist these structures that exist both in Puerto Rico, right, here, and in the world, right? We have to view this as in this world geography as well. And that's what they're going up against, in a sense, are these structures themselves. So I think it's hard to quantify that.
Okay. Eduardo, feel free if you want to do a follow-up or anything like that.
Right. It's just a thought that I do some work with community development organizations in terms of their own businesses. And what I found is that they undervalue what they have, and they kind of, they get held on because of that. Mm-hmm. And I do some work with the Puerto Rico Chamber of Commerce in Central Florida, and I see a different attitude in terms of they have, I think, more of a sense of control, or let's say they are more in control of their destiny, if you can call it that way, than the same type of situation in Puerto Rico. And my initial thought is that something has happened in terms of the environment and their need to survive in a different environment that has made them more, again, in control of what they can do and what their future can be. So I was wondering if you had seen the same type of situation in your research or not.
Well, certainly the activists that I've worked with here had that sense of agency, of trying to change their situation and envision a future that included Puerto Ricans, you know, in this landscape, in this national landscape, in Florida and in Puerto Rico. So there was that sense of empowerment and working against these structures and these oppressive systems.
Okay, thank you. And congratulations on your work, excellent.
Thank you.
I wish you, or I hope you publish it in a book.
Oh yeah, that's the plan. This is going to become my manuscript.
Great.
Our next question, Dr. Torres, would you like for me to continue feeding you the questions?
Yes, because it's hard to keep up with the chat.
No problem. Okay. Next question from Tim Hawthorne. Thanks for sharing this work, Dr. Torres. I'm a faculty member at UCF and work with lots of developing student researchers. Can you share advice about how to engage in activist-based research?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. Thank you. And I was actually teaching ethnography, ethnographic methods at UCF this past semester. So I think that that was a really good introduction to trying to speak with students about this and this type of work. The first thing I would say is to educate yourselves about the communities. The way that I approach my work is that my interlocutors, right, have more knowledge than, you know, I can read in any book, or that, you know, I always go in telling them, you know, I'm not the expert, right? You are. So really learn about your communities and the communities that you want to do this engaged research in, and listen. Listen to what's already happening, right? And then try to see, well, you know, like, how can I get involved? How can I help? Whether it's through volunteering, and seeing what the needs are, right? But then there's also, you know, a responsibility as researchers to do this ethically, right? Think about the risks when you don't want to do this type of engaged research and activist work to the communities that you're working with. So I think that it's always this constant dialectic, right? You have to have these conversations, but you also have a responsibility as a researcher going in and acknowledging your privileged position, especially, you know, as a student, if you're going to be doing research in these types of areas.
Thank you. Next question is from Patricia Silver. My question is about Puerto Rican activism and the recent nationwide, worldwide, and multiracial embrace of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it is prompted by those that argue that the Puerto Rican ideal of mestizaje or tres razas erases or at least subjugates Blackness. Based on your research and from your perspective as a Puerto Rican woman activist, how do you see this impacting Puerto Rican alliances in this racially charged time?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that I've been thinking about a lot recently because of the events happening in this country and around the world. And I think to your point about political coalitions, right? I think that in order to build these coalitions, we need to reject such notions, like these ideas of racial mixture, right? Because in many ways it does erase Blackness. And part of building these bridges and engaging in the works to dismantle anti-Blackness, we need to also be cognizant about how we also uphold anti-Blackness in our own communities. And part of that is the reason why I shared the words of that one activist, the Afro-Boricua activist, right, who pointed out that when she brings up Black Lives Matter, right, it's like, okay, we're gonna stand in solidarity, right? And she points out, right, the assumption is that those aren't our issues, but they are our issues, right? We have Afro-Latinos, right? There are Black people across Latin America, and there's anti-Blackness in Latin America, and in our own families, in our communities, right? And so we also need to see these struggles as intertwined and not separate. And part of that is, yes, addressing it with our communities, right, and having these conversations, but also realizing how these discourses that we've historically used, like mestizaje, continue to uphold anti-Blackness.
Patricia, feel free if you want to add anything, or are you good? Let me unmute you.
I forgot to unmute. So no, just to say thank you again, Julie, for this amazing work. And I too am looking forward to the book coming out as soon as possible.
Thank you. Oh, and I should also add that intersectionality with this conversation of anti-Blackness is also incredibly important. because Black women in particular are disproportionately affected by anti-Blackness.
Thank you.
The next question is from, it is cutting off here. I believe it says Laura, but I can't see in there. Can you help me, Dr. Rivera, please? Oh, Laura Barrios Morillo. Yes. It says, you mentioned that you look up to many Black and Latinx feminists. Who are some of the Black and Latinx feminists or authors who touch upon intersectional feminist theories that you base your ideas on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Kimberly Crenshaw she's the one that coined the term intersectionality, right? She's a legal and feminist scholar, so definitely check out her work. Patricia Hill Collins. There are also for the Latinx scholars that I do look up to and admire their work. Sherry Moraga and Anzaldúa, who are feminist thinkers who have also, pointed to some of these issues as well. And I would be more than happy if you shoot me an email at the contact information that I listed. I can send you some more names and a reading list if that's something you'd like to pursue.
Thank you. Next, we have Tim Hawthorne, who has asked if he could ask the question himself. Tim? Tim Hawthorne, would you still like to ask the question? 3, 2. Okay, when Tim is ready, we will go back to Tim. We have a question from Miguel Morales. Do you know about research about Puerto Ricans' use of humor when faced with adversity and disaster?
That's an interesting question, and certainly would be interesting to look into. It's not something that I've covered in the scope of my research or read a lot into, but it's certainly a worthwhile area of study. But no, I don't know of any research off the top of my head. But if you find it, then definitely let me know.
Yeah, and that question was from Maria Reyes. So thank you, Maria, for your question.
Next, we have a question from Alessandra Rosa. How can we translate the Puerto Rican activism you described into voting participation in U.S. politics, especially for the upcoming election?
No, that's certainly an excellent and a timely question, right? And it's a question that comes up every election cycle, and that a lot of the activists that I spoke with were very passionate about, right? So how do we translate this into voting? And from my conversations, right, there are a lot of obstacles to this, especially with recent arrivals, right, who are concerned with living their everyday lives and surviving here and finding jobs and affordable housing, right? So in a lot of ways, sometimes, voting may be far from their mind. But what I've tried to show in my work is how these activists are trying to translate this work into voter participation through registering people to vote and explaining how the system here in Florida, right, is very different than in Puerto Rico, right? Is one day everyone goes out and votes, it's a national holiday. Here in Florida, like I've lost count of how many elections we have, and there's always some special election, right? So it's part of the education, and they're doing that here through radio programs, right? These push to get out the votes. There were many groups here that hosted electoral caravanas, right? These parades of cars to try to encourage people to go out and vote with, lots of cars and noise and parandas, right? So these are all ways that these activists are trying to combat that. and try to increase the numbers of Puerto Ricans going out to vote, right? But it's a struggle and that comes up every election cycle. But they are actively doing that type of work to push out the vote.
Thank you. Next is a comment from Crizia Lopez, Colectivo, and please correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Is it Y? And Revista Étnica are great resources. They do the anti-racista work and anti-Blackness at the island. That's from Crizia Lopez Arce. And then we have a question, a comment from Eduardo Arroyo. And Eduardo says, my perception from the island end, I feel that Puerto Rican activism is fragmented in Florida, like here, like in here, he says. Any thoughts on my perception? If so, what can be done to strengthen the influence and improving on this fragmentation?
Yeah, so activism is messy, right? Trying to build solidarity is messy, especially when here, right, there are different, political opinions in terms of, status. There are people migrating, from New York and Chicago, where the political landscape looks very different, and where they have been, engaged in this type of work and for years, many, many years, and the infrastructure is there in a lot of ways. And here in Florida, the landscape is different, right? There are many more recent arrivals, right? But then there are struggles around funding, right? And money becomes very central to a lot of that fragmentation, right? So in a lot of ways, the activists doing the work here need resources, right? They need those resources to continue the work. And with all of these efforts, right, historically social movements, right, there's always some level of fragmentation. That's to be expected. It's how do you overcome that, right? And part of it is resources. Part of it is, realizing that you're all working towards a common struggle, and that happened here, right? Moving towards a common goal, even though, you have different political opinions and you have different experiences yourself. So there have been cases where I've witnessed here that it is possible to supersede those types of fragmentations, right? It happens, it's messy, right? And then there are arguments, certainly, and there are rifts, right? But when you have a common goal, in a lot of ways, that takes greater precedence. And we've seen that happen here in Orlando.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we have a question from Ashley Rivera Mercado. How do you recommend younger, more politically active Puerto Ricans engage their parents into activist movements or meaningful activism here in Orlando when they do not feel as involved in U.S. politics?
I think with your question, I go back to that whole idea of politics in rice and beans terms, right? And I think it's about talking to them about how it affects them on the everyday level, right? At the dinner table, through these other areas that they might actually, be very invested in and interested in, right? So if they do care about education, right? That's politics. Like a lot of this is politics, and it's things that they can get involved in, and it's also recognizing that there are different forms of activism, right? Not everyone is an activist that goes out into the streets and is protesting, right? There are other ways to become involved in your communities, whether it's through writing letters to legislators or like, talking to your neighbors and talking about different changes that can be done in the community. So I think it's about having those types of conversations and maybe approaching it through what is meaningful to them and finding the connections between these larger issues through everyday issues.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any questions or any comments before we close out?
I just want to thank everyone who's also shared resources. There are some great resources in the chat as well. And thank you all for your questions.
All right, if nobody has questions at this time, I do want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone who participated, and Dr. Fernando Rivera, Dr. Julie Torres, for your time, and hopefully we will see you again on the next one. Thank you very much. Dr. Rivera?
Yes, thank you. So continue to follow us, continue our work. We're building this. This is a community effort, and we want to make sure that we continue having an impact here, especially in these times of crises, right? Then we need to have this information more and more. So thank you, everybody. Be on the lookout for the next one, and have a productive day. And thank you again, Julie, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone.